Hungary's slave labour laws. Protesters again vent their anger at new legislation, which includes forced overtime. Prime Minister Viktor Orban is already facing EU sanctions for flouting rules on democracy. How will he deal with growing challenges both at home and abroad? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Laura Kyle. The right-wing Prime Minister of Hungary is at the centre of yet more controversy. Viktor Orban faced unprecedented disciplinary action from the European Parliament a few months ago for breaching core democratic values of the EU. And the streets of Budapest were packed on Sunday for another mass protest against new legislation which trade unions, opposition parties, students and others all say amount to modern-day slavery. They're demanding the laws are revoked, as well as freedom for the media and independence for the judiciary. Roy Challens has our report.
For the fourth day now, protesters have been on the streets of the Hungarian capital, Budapest. Recent law changes have brought thousands of people out to denounce Prime Minister Viktor Orban's right-wing government.
I think that discontent is growing, and with this, not only anger and frustration, but also those voices which would like to make change.
I
have had enough, and so have my friends. This is now not about opposition politicians, about who stands on which side, but this is about the discontent of the Hungarian society, that we have had enough.
The rally started last Wednesday following the passing of two new laws. One gives the government control over a new administrative court system. The other, perhaps more unpopular move, increases allowable workplace overtime from 250 to 400 hours a year. Viktor Orban's majority in Parliament allowed him to push through the legislation despite complaints from trade unions, rights groups and opposition parties. They say increasing overtime could harm workers' health and the government shouldn't control the courts. The government says it wants a more efficient legal system and a more flexible labour code.
I think what these protests suggest is that underlying the apparent popularity of the government, as seen in election time, obviously, and also in opinion polls, there is a considerable amount of resentment and discontent in Hungarian society. And that this kind of resentment comes to the fore when the government introduces legislation that is seen by many as being against their interests.
The EU has seemed unsure how to respond to a government in one of its member states consolidating power by restricting civil liberties. But in September, the European Parliament voted to impose sanctions on Hungary for ignoring EU rules on democracy, civil rights and corruption. The government says those claims are not true. Viktor Orban says his aim is to build an illiberal democracy in Hungary, and he's faced little meaningful opposition. But anger over the so-called slave law is a reminder that it does still exist. Rory Challens, Al Jazeera.
Let's introduce our panel now, and joining us via Skype from Budapest we have Károly, György, International Secretary of the Hungarian Trade Union Confederation. In Berlin, Ulrich Brueckner, John Monnet Professor in European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. And also via Skype from Budapest, Gergely, Rajnai, an analyst at Hungary's Centre for Fair Political Analysis. A very warm welcome to all of you. Károly, let's start with you, because this new labour law, I mean, this is what sparked these protests, which have been going on now for 4 days against the government. But how much are they an outburst of broader discontent against Viktor Orban's policies?
Well, first of all, this hasn't started a couple of days ago. It has started already back in 2010-11, when a new labor code was introduced. Changes which very much destroyed previously acquired rights, both for the individual worker and for the collective interest defense. And I think it has been just part of a major change in the pattern of policy making, whereby it is not an inclusive way of doing politics, but an exclusive. Those in power know everything best, and they don't require partners, negotiating partners. So that's how we got to this law. Already 2 years ago, changes in the labor code have worsened further the situation, and finally we ended up with this, as in the interview before mentioned, slavery measures, which practically we see will very definitely worsen the living conditions of the workers, because practically it is going to introduce a kind of 6 weeks working week, which me personally have experienced as a child back in the 1960s before the introduction of the free Saturdays. I remember back I saw my parents and I saw my family during the Sunday only. And this is what we fear again, since there is a very significant imbalance between in the power relation between the employer and the worker. The worker might say no, but that might risk his or her job. So there is a significant and important fear of us that as of 1st of January, when the law comes into force, people, and now I speak about 4.6 million laborers, employees. That means practically every Hungarian family will have a chance to experience the negative ways.
Okay.
And that's why
Let me just jump in there and get an idea from Gergely how necessary this new law is, because Viktor Orban, of course, says there's a labour shortage and therefore Hungary needs it.
I think that Orban states that it's necessary because he wants to pass it. That has been his reasoning in the past. I think that in this case, it was a little too much, little too quickly. Orban has, as we've heard before, introduced similar measures or measures in similar direction before, but it was always a slower process. Now it comes on top of a lot of controversial issues, like, as mentioned in the report, the EU vote on Hungary, and also the universities have issues, and the Hungarian Academy of Sciences have issues getting funding from the government. And that there are a bunch of issues that are all pushed by the government at this particular time. And I think that a lot of similar laws have been passed before, but this has reached a tipping point right now. So I don't think that this particular law was necessary, or this particular law is particularly controversial in the Hungarian society, but because of a number of other laws and measures that have been passed very recently, it has reached a tipping point, and that's why we see all the discontent that we saw in the report.
It's the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were, because as we know, we've often seen Orban at loggerheads with the EU, but how unusual is it to spark this amount of anger at home?
It is not perfectly unprecedented. There have been similar protests against the media law back in 2011 and 12, similar protests against issues with the Central European University, which have basically concluded now, and Central European University will move out of Hungary into Vienna. So there have been similar protests in the last 8 years, and also particularly with the internet tax reform that was proposed in 2015. There were huge protests, much bigger than the one right now. And in all of those cases, Orban has managed to somehow alleviate the tensions in time. It remains to be seen if it's the case this time.
Károly, what do you think? If you look back at all those other protests, did you get the feeling, did you get the impression that Orban was actually listening to them? How did he manage to alleviate the tensions? And do you think he will be able to this time?
Well, first of all, my experience and our experience is that there has not been any real listening on the other side. We could achieve certain, I would say, kind of gains in negotiations, whatever they might have been. But in real terms, what has been decided by the top went through. And that has also something to do with the perception that there is no real need for dialogue neither with any part of the society nor with the social partners. As for the word of labor, that's what we criticize heavily, that not even in the international conventions set patterns are in place. We have rarely chances to get our voice through. Just like I would say, many say that we have freedom of speech, freedom of press. Yes, I can go and we can go on the street, express our opinion, but it doesn't get through the media because it's mostly in the hand of the government.
Uli, what's been the EU response to this so far?
Well, there is a procedure to investigate the state of democratic changes or anti-democratic changes within a country. And the European Parliament presented a long list of violations or points that give reasons to be concerned. And since we are pretty bad as social scientists to predict the future, it came as a surprise that a relatively minor case in all these major changes actually triggered such an opposition. The European Union presents this as some sort of a naming and shaming policy, because at the end of the day, it's not really likely that everyone stands strongly together, like in the Brexit case, and accuses Orban of violating fundamental principles of the European Union, because every country has more or less problems, and especially Orban can count on Poland, because there's also an investigation going on regarding the changes in Poland. And so it's not the most powerful instrument to get a country like Hungary back on track, what is considered to be Western principles, but at least it puts it in the spotlight and hopes to mobilize internal pressure for change.
I certainly want to delve deeper into the EU response and what the EU can do a little later in the discussion. First of all, I just want to get an idea of who is Viktor Orban. Well, he gained wide recognition for his speech in 1989 when he demanded Soviet troops leave Hungary and free elections. He's one of the founding members of the Fidesz party, which shifted Hungary from the centre-right to the far-right. Orban became Prime Minister for the first time in 1998. He returned in 2010 and has won 3 consecutive terms since then. He's been criticised for his anti-immigration policies and for weakening Hungary's democratic institutions. Gergely, Orban is on track to becoming the longest-serving Prime Minister in Hungarian history. What is his appeal?
Viktor Orban has done a lot to get here. He has started with a very small party in the 1990s, won the election in 1998 with a broad coalition with a lot of different right-wing parties. And by 2010, he consolidated all of the right-wing parties into one single conglomerate that he's at the helm of. So he worked a lot to create a political community that is very loyal to him, that the members of which are very loyal to each other and will vote for him no matter what. And because of this political community, he can achieve a tremendous amount of success in the Hungarian political system. But that doesn't mean that he is supported by every Hungarian. He's supported by about 30–40% of the Hungarian people and the electorate. And that is enough because the political committee is so active and so loyal to him that his power is now unquestioned.
Károly, you mentioned before that one of the problems that Hungary has is that there's no dialogue when it comes to passing laws, new policies. And when you look at Orban's 2/3 majority in parliament, one wonders if the opposition is able to oppose anything.
Well, I think this is a real question. There is a serious gap. If you look at the opinion polls, and about if you look at the what happens within the polling stations, and you listen to people in pubs, at school, in your family, in your friend circles, you get opposing views. You get support for Orban at the polling station, and you get very heavy criticism. As I would see, and as I see, there is not any single part of the society, single group of the society, which has not been under certain, subject to certain negative changes. On the other hand, certain groups received also positive changes over the past years. So it is a kind of divide et impera, divide and rule game, what we see, and also the fact that the policy making relies on this very closed group of people, what my colleague mentioned, and what has been declared already some over 10 years ago. It's one flag, one camp. You unite and we win. On the other hand, the opposition is splintered, the opposition is fragmented, and that's how the democratic opposition is not really able to move. What we saw yesterday, for the first time after a very, very long time, all the opposition parties came together with the trade unions in the demonstration. And that might give a certain light at the end of the tunnel.
OK. Gergely, if the opposition is indeed splintered at home, to what extent do Hungarians look to the EU as a body, as an institution that might be able to temper Viktor Orban and his power?
So the European Union is viewed in a very good light in Hungary, despite some campaigns to the contrary by the government. It's a very popular institution among Hungarians, and especially opposition voters. So they always look to conform to EU rules, get closer to Europe. That's pretty much the goal that most opposition voters and parties are trying to pursue in different paths, of course. Therefore, they really expect the EU to be very active against Orban, but I think that it's not Brussels' job to vote Orban out of office. He's legitimately elected. He has a very broad electorate. Is a very active political community that elects him. That need to be convinced if the opposition wants to win, and the opposition seems to try to appeal to the same voters that it always gets. But it has to gather new voters, and in order to get that, it has to take up some of the responsibility which we are seeing now, because beforehand we only saw them assuming basically zero responsibility, always pointing to Orban and always pointing to Europe, that they should do something different. But now they are, for the first time in a very long time, they are seen as an active actor in Hungarian politics, and that is very positive. That could be a very positive message for a lot of voters who could turn to vote against Orban in the next elections.
Uli, we saw that the EU invoked Article 7 back in September on the very basis that the Orban government violated the rule of law. What did that set into motion, and what's it going to lead to?
Well, it's relatively easy to put pressure from the EU side on candidate countries and tell them, this is what we stand for, this is our understanding of a Western-type democratic system, and if you are not in line with this, we don't accept you. But once you are in and you sit in all the institutions and you are represented and the EU decides with unanimous vote, it's much harder to push a certain interpretation of what is a Western-type democratic system through. And I think this is now the schizophrenia, that on the one hand we embrace a culture of diversity, and the EU has been developing along the lines of where Western-type democratic societies stood. And when we look at the different capitals, with all their very liberal lifestyles, it's different from what we experience in the countryside in Hungary. And here Orban has a case in presenting an alternative model to just imitate the West. But it's extremely hard for the EU, on the one hand, to legitimize why a democratically elected government should do a particular thing. And on the other hand, they can only show the nuclear option, which is freezing the membership right of a country like Hungary, and nobody wants this, neither the Hungarians nor the European Union.
Because also one must remember that Viktor Orban is by no means a lone voice within the EU, is he? Is very much part of his party, is very much part of this centre-right coalition in the European Parliament. I'm thinking Marine Le Pen with her Nationalist Party, a number of others, Poland, for example, elements in Austria. To what extent does this nationalist voice present a threat when it's all thrown in together to the EU more broadly?
Well, we see a general trend that the populist agenda of personalizing power, dismantling the separation of power, putting pressure on judges, putting journalists into prison or streamlining media leads to a relatively successful strategy no matter where exactly you stand as a political organization. And when we look at previous European parliamentary elections, then we had a pretty broad spectrum of political parties, but a very fundamental agreement on what the European Union is and what it stands for. What we now see with all the different Orbans and developments in Italy and the right-wing leaders that you mentioned is a much more politicized European parliamentary election that will also politicize the European Union, in which it is no longer just about how exactly do we run migration policy or the euro, but there are a number of very fundamentalist voices that try to get rid of the European Union and create something like a union of nationalist forces.
Gergely, what's the extent that Orban and his government have got their eye on the EU? How much do they care about events there in Brussels? I'm thinking of this parliamentary election that's coming up in May. That might shake things up. It might allow more protection for this centre-right coalition, or indeed it might break it up. What effects it's going to have on Orban's party?
They very much have their eye on the upcoming European elections. Firstly, because Orban, since basically 2014, has focused on Europe mainly and not really on Hungarian internal affairs. Domestic politics have been delegated to other politicians. Orban is mainly focusing on international politics. So it's very important for him to shape Europe, not just be a member of Europe. And this election gives him an opportunity to do that because, as you mentioned, there are other forces that might ally with Orban after the election that might want to change Europe as we know today, and that is what his goal is. At the same time, Fidesz, Orban's party, is still a member of the European People's Party, which is pretty much an establishment party and the largest party in the European Parliament. And Fidesz is a very important member of that group. So if they can gain even more ground in the European elections, they can even shape the European People's Party into more of a populist force that can really shape a European agenda. So the European elections are crucial for Orban, I think even more crucial than any Hungarian elections at this point, because his goal now is to become a European leader, not just a Hungarian one.
Oh, interesting. OK, so Károly, what do you think the run-up to that May election is going to be like? Are we going to see these protests continuing?
Well, definitely, as the law comes into force, this slavery law, we will be doing different actions and we will have to see how our colleagues and members react and are ready to join in. But as for the European parliamentary election, definitely we will also put forward our vision of a future of Europe and future of Hungary. And we say, first of all, that without the democracy at the world of work, without democracy at the workplace, there is no democracy at all. Either you maintain rights at work or there are no human rights applied. So that will be our point of departure. And what we want to see is go beyond lip service, like signing and subscribing to the European Pillar of Social Rights and have it put on place. And also the international standards and conventions, have it in practice. So that's basically what our members and the working people, and I told you it's around 4.6 million people at work, they really deserve. So for us, the upcoming European parliamentary election is also crucial because it will set for a long time the path we go. And here I fully agree with my colleague who spoke that we have to fight this fight here in Hungary internally. Externally, we see it can help, but the fight is
And there we have to leave that very interesting discussion. Great to get your expertise on the subject. Thanks very much to all our guests for joining us here on Inside Story. Károly, György, Ulrich Brueckner and Gergely Rajnai. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.